Assalamu alaikum. I have a question for you. Do you sometimes find yourself not knowing the basic things about the deen? I mean, sometimes someone might ask you a question and you're kind of stumped for an answer. Don't you wish that you had the answers to some of the basic things that you have to do as a Muslim day to day? If so, then perhaps you may be interested in studying your deen. We have an Islamic studies program, and if you'd like to join it, you can find more information on it by clicking the link below and joining our Telegram group. And if you like it, you can register for the first year. And hopefully we see you on the other side. Assalamu alaikum. Peace. I want to go through an exercise with you guys. We as Muslims at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, how many groups were there? How many sects were there? There was one sect of Muslims. Okay. Yes, there was that Khariji man that came out at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but a proper group was not formed. So how many groups, how many sects existed at the time of the Prophet ﷺ? How many existed? How many? Who can tell me the number? How many existed? How many existed? One. Fantastic. One sect existed. There was no deviation. There was one sect. Everyone was either a companion or the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ was teaching the companions, and the companions were learning from the Prophet ﷺ, and they were on the same path. What did they call themselves at that time? What did they call themselves at that time? What did they call themselves? They called themselves Muslimin. Sammakumul Muslimin. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us in the Quran that Allah is the one we have been called Muslimin. Our name is Muslim. Okay? The term Sunni wasn't even used. Following the Sunnah was used, but there was no usage of the word Ahlus Sunnah at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. There was one group. Okay, good. When the Prophet ﷺ died, and the people of innovation started to come out, at the time of the Sahaba, the Qadariyah, they came out. The Khawarij, they came out. The Mu'tazila, they came out. The Ali Shia, they came out. These groups, they started to come out at the time of the Sahaba. What these groups used to do was that they used to use the word Muslim as well. Do you see? Do you follow here? Yes? There was only one group. There was only one name for that one group. And that name was Muslim. Now, at the time when everyone was upon the same understanding and aqidah and creed, they were understanding of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, either by virtue of the fact that they were companions, or the Prophet ﷺ himself, who was teaching his companions and they were upon what he was upon, of course. The only term that was needed was Muslim. But now the term Muslim is being misappropriated, because you have Qadariyah whose beliefs have fallen in towards kufr, and they're calling themselves Muslim. Like today, how the Ahmadiyya, they call themselves. What do the Ahmadiyya call themselves? The ones who follow the other prophet, Ghulam Mirza Ahmad. What do they call themselves today? They call themselves Muslim. The grave worshippers today, from the Shia and the Brelviya and the Sufis generally, they call themselves Muslim. But this is not Islam. This is in fact disbelief. Does that make sense? So at the time of the companions, you had these Qadariyah that came out, and they had beliefs that were kufr. And we all know the famous hadith when the Prophet's companion Abdullah ibn Umar radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma was informed that there were these people that were disbelieving in the issue of Qadr, and they were rejecting the Qadr. He said, inform them that I am free from them and they are free from me. And even if they gave the mountain of Uhud in gold, even if they gave gold that weighed the mountain of Uhud, it will not be accepted from them until they come back to belief of Qadr. Why won't it be accepted? Because they're kuffar. Because they disbelieved. They fell out of Islam. That's why their deeds are not being accepted. Does that make sense? So now there's a problem, because you've got people that have these beliefs that are kufar, and they are calling themselves Muslims. Does that make sense? Not just that, there are those that may not have reached kufr, but they're bid'ah, and they're from the 72 sects that are going to go into the hellfire, like the Khawarij, like the Mu'tazila, and they are also calling themselves Muslim. So then now the term Muslim is being used for those that are actually not even Muslim, and the term Muslim is being used for those that are Muslim, but they're from the 72 sects that are going to go to the hellfire. So then Abdullah ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma coined the term Ahlus Sunnati wal Jama'ah. Ahlus Sunnati wal Jama'ah. Abdullah ibn Abbas. Who is Abdullah ibn Abbas? He was the companion of the Prophet ﷺ that the Prophet made dua for. He said, Allahumma faqihu fi din wa allimhu ta'wil. Oh Allah, give him a deep understanding of the religion and teach him the interpretation of the Quran. Is the dua of the Prophet ﷺ accepted? Yes or no? Of course it is. The dua of the Prophet ﷺ is accepted. So the Prophet's dua was to teach Ibn Abbas, for Allah to teach Ibn Abbas the deep interpretation of the deen and of the Quran. So is the dua accepted? Yes. So that's why we give a lot of weight to the tafsir and the explanation of Abdullah ibn Abbas, because he was explaining something based on the dua of the Prophet ﷺ for him to have that knowledge. So when it came to the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, يَوْمَ تَبْيَضُّ وُجُوهٌ وَتَسْوَدُّ وُجُوهٌ. On the day of judgment, there will be those that faces will be gloomy, they'll be darkened. And there will be those their faces will be brightened. Does that make sense? Faces will be gloomy and faces will be bright. Does that make sense? He said the ones that are gloomy are the people of bid'ah. He said, Ahlul furqa wal ahwa, the people of division, the people of disunity, the people of bid'ah and desires. Ahlul bid'ah. The ones whose faces will be brightened is Ahlul sunnati wal jama'ah. Because through the text, put aside the term Ahlul furqa and Ahlul Ahwa, and put aside the term Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. We know from the text that there is bid'ah and there is sunnah, right? That's clear. The Prophet ﷺ told us, follow my sunnah. He told us, don't do bid'ah. He told us that there will be people that, he taught us there will be people that will be following the sunnah, and there will be people that are, there will be people that are what? There will be people that are going away from the sunnah, that are following the bid'ah. So people of sunnah, people of bid'ah. So this ayah, when Allah is talking about those whose faces will be brightened, these are the ones who follow the sunnah. Those whose faces will be gloomy are those who didn't follow the sunnah, they opposed it, they fell into bid'ah. Now pay attention. So Ibn Abbas wanted to describe the people who follow the sunnah. He called them Ahlus Sunnati wal Jama'ah. Those who follow the sunnah and then they unite upon it. And then he wanted to give a name to the people of bid'ah. He called them Ahlul Furqati wal Ahwa, the ones who disunite from the Sunnah and then they follow their desires. So pay attention. When Ibn Abbas used the term Ahlul Sunnah, he was describing the group of Muslims that follow the Sunnah that already existed. Was he describing a new group? Or was he describing a group that already existed? Answer this question for me, yes or no, so I know you're engaged. Was he describing a group that already existed, or was he describing a new group? Beautiful. He was describing a group that already existed. I have a question. Is it that we have is the prohibition in Islam that we're not allowed to make new groups, or that we're not allowed to give new descriptions to pre-existing groups? I repeat my question. Is the prohibition in Islam that we are not, is it that what we're not allowed to do is that we're not allowed to make new groups? Or is it that we're not allowed to give new descriptions to the group that already exists? Barakallahu feekum. We're not allowed to make new groups. But where is the prohibition to say we cannot give new descriptions to pre-existing groups? What I mean by that is a group that already exists, but I can describe it in another way. Today I can tell you this group is the strangers, al-ghuraba. Then tomorrow I could tell you, wait, they're called Ahlul Hadith. And then the next day I can call you, they're called Ahlul Athar, who follow the Athar. Then I can say they're Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. I can tell you they're Firqatu Najah, they're the saved sect. These are all descriptions. These are all descriptions for the same group. So a new group hasn't been invented. Does that make sense? A new group has not been invented. It hasn't been invented. I haven't got to Salafiyyah yet. But the point is, I want you guys to understand, is that so far, understand historically, when the term Ahlul Sunnah came, a new group, yes, it will be uploaded inshallah ta'ala, a new group wasn't invented. All that happened was that the group that already existed, it got a new name. Question, why did it get, why not a new name, sorry, a new description? Why did it get a new description? Why did it get a new description? Barakallahu feek, it's a description, not the name of a new group. Do you get that? That's the underlying factor that even many Salafis themselves don't realize. That Salafiyyah is a description of the group that the Prophet talked about that will be the saved sect. It's not a new group. So we'll come to Salafiyyah in a second. But the question I want to ask is, why did Ibn Abbas feel the need to give this new description? By the way, it wasn't describing something that was a bid'ah. It was describing something that already existed, but he was describing it in a new way. And there's no textual evidence that prohibits us from describing things. We describe things as language evolves, a situation evolves. We describe the similar things in different ways, right? In different ways. Even we describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We know that, for example, that describing Allah in a certain way, we can describe Him in a way that He didn't subhanahu wa ta'ala name Himself. Like Allah can be described for His names and attributes, but we can also describe Him in a way that is above and beyond His names and attributes, provided that it follows certain principles and conditions. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So the question I want to ask is that why did Ibn Abbas feel the need to do this? The reason he did it was because now there's something called tamayyuz which needs to take place. We need to differentiate. Why do we need to differentiate? If you go to the ayah of da'wah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي, say this is my path. أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ, I give da'wah to Allah, to tawheed. عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ, I do it upon knowledge. أَنَا وَمَنِ اتَّبَعَنِي, me and those who follow me. وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ, and I am not from the people who do shirk. Why did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam get told to say that at the end? And I am not from the people who do shirk. Why did he have to mention that? This is called tamyiz, distinguishing. This is a big part of Islam. What I believe, what you believe is different. قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ, O you who disbelieve. O you who disbelieve. قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ, O you who disbelieve. O kuffar, I don't worship what you worship, and you don't worship what I worship. Why? Tamyiz. We believe we're different. There's a line between us. What I believe, what you believe is different. Does that make sense? This clarification has to be there. So it has to be there between kufr and Islam, and it has to be there between sunnah and bid'ah. So that's why he did it. That's why he did it. Okay? And that's why the Salaf, who were those three generations, they used to, what did they used to do? They used to describe Ahlul Sunnah in these ways. They used to describe them through Firqatul Najah, the saved sect, because of the hadith about the 73 sects. They used to describe them as those who follow the Sunnah and unite upon the Sunnah based on the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned that فَإِنَّهُ مَن يَعِشْ مِنْكُمْ بَعْدِي فَسَيَرَى اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِسُنَّتِي وَسُنَّةِ الْخُلَفَاءِ الرَّاشِدِينَ الْمَهْدِيِّينَ. Sunnah there, Ahlul Sunnah. Does that make sense? They called themselves al-ghuraba, the strangers. Why? They called themselves strangers because the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, Bada Islam ghariban. Islam started as something strange and it will return back strange. Kama bada, the way it started, or kama qal. So Islam started something strange at the time of Prophet ﷺ and his companions. So then those Prophet ﷺ and his companions were strangers. So then the correct belief was the belief of the strangers. So they used these, and al-hadith, that's another term. People think Ahl Hadith, Salafiyyah, Ahl Sunnah are different. No, they're all the same. Why is it that the term Ahl Hadith is famous in Pakistan, India? Because in Pakistan, India, the people that are known for Hadith and following, the Hadith and the Sunnah, Al-Bukhari, Muslim, Sunnah Abi Dawud, Tirmidhi, they are people who follow the Sunnah and they're called Ahl Hadith. At the time, the Salaf also used to call themselves Ahl Hadith because the people used to follow their aql, their intellects above the text. If the text and the intellect seemed like it was contradicting, they would choose the intellect, their own mind over the text. To differentiate between them and the people who follow the text, they call themselves Ahl Hadith. So that's why these terms came. And one of the terms that was coined was the term Salafi or Salafiyyah. What is the evidence for this term? The evidence for this term is the fact, what is the evidence for this description, I should say rather? The evidence is the fact that in the language, when you look, Salafiyyah means taqaddam. It means it means that which comes before. So the Prophet ﷺ told us in the hadith that the best of generations, khairun nas qarni, the best generation is my generation, ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُم, then the ones who come after my generation, ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُم, and then the ones who come after my generation. وَكَمَا قَالَ. So the Prophet ﷺ told us 3 generations were the best. Him, his generation, i.e. the Sahaba, the next generation which is the Tabi'een, and then the 3rd generation which is the Atba'u Tabi'een, which ended around about the time of Imam al-Bukhari. It ended in the year 221, if I'm not mistaken. 221 is when it ended. Okay, so we have a hadith that talks about 3 earlier generations, and we were told to follow we were told to follow the companions through many textual evidences, and you can go back to Manhaj Mondays, you can go back to many lectures that I've done. I think the first lecture on Manhaj Mondays, I gave evidences for the importance of following the Sahaba and how we have to follow the Sahaba. I briefly alluded to them in the hadith of the 73 sects, where the Prophet ﷺ said the only ones that will be saved are the ones who follow me and follow my companions. Then we have this other hadith which mentions 2 other generations after the companions, so there's 3 generations altogether. So in other words, we're supposed to follow those that came before. Right, so then the Salaf, these men at that time, decided to use the term Salaf to describe these men who came before. That's what it was. So then the term Ahlul Sunnah, the term Al-Ghuraba, the strangers, the term Firqatul Najah, the safe sect, the term Ta'ifatul Mansura, the group that's given victory, the term Al-Hadith, the term Al-Athar, and the term Salafiyyun are all descriptions for the group that the Prophet ﷺ told us will be saved. Does that make sense? So the question is, historically then, what was the need to add another description, Salafiyyah? What was the need to add that description? The reason why that description needed to be added was because the Mu'tazila became famous. And when the Mu'tazila became famous, the Mu'tazila used to use the term Ahlul Sunnah for themselves, as today the Asha'ira use the term Ahlul Sunnah for themselves. So now the term Ahlul Sunnah wasn't enough to make a clarification. At that time, Ahlul Sunnah was good, because the Jahmiyyah were clearly not Sunni. Okay? The Shia were clearly not. The Qadiriyah were clearly not. Does that make sense? But the Mu'tazila, they played with people. And the Ash'ara, they played with people. They made it they used the term Ahlul Sunnah for themselves. The term Ibn Abbas coined for the right path, for the correct group, they used it for themselves. The same way many people of Bid'ah do that today, right? Don't we? Is this not a common tactic? Do the Deobandis not call themselves Sunni? Do the Barelvis who worship graves not call themselves Sunni? Do these groups not call themselves Sunni even today? Yes. So because the lines became so blurry, the term, and remember the Mu'tazila reached government level. They reached government level and it became the Aqidah that was enforced in all of the Muslim lands. So it became famous. And then they said, by the way, we're the Sunnis. So it became even more confusing now. So then the term Salafiyyah started to become famous. Because Salafiyyah was a description that goes above and beyond Ahlul Sunnah. Okay, Mu'tazila said we follow the Sunnah, and the Ahlul Sunnah said we follow the Sunnah. But the Sunnah we follow is according to the understanding of the companions and the Tabi'in and the Atba'u Tabi'in. Mu'tazila, your following of the Sunnah, is it in accordance to the Sahaba and the students of Sahaba and this? No. Okay, so the fine line between us and you, O Mu'tazila, is that we follow Salaf's understanding of the Sunnah, which we have textual evidences for, i.e. the companions and their students and their students' students. That's what it is. That's all it is. Does that make sense?